in terms of what they do, the kinds of questions that they ask, what research is important, what's interesting, who decides those questions now? Well, we have to decide that in conversation with communities. It's not these white people in a room deciding what questions are important anymore. We have to kind of shift that to deciding together what are the issues at stake, what are the things to ask. And Indigenous methodologies in a long, for the most part, was very strong in helping researchers all around the world reflect on some of those issues, some of those historical problems, abuses, and so forth, and trying to help people do research in a more ethical way and in a good way going forward. So a big thing with Indigenous methodologies, it might still involve interviews, it might still involve like a PAR project, but the core distinguishing feature about it is this aspect of relationship between the researcher and the community, that being researched. And Indigenous methodologies really talks about the importance of that authentic engagement and good relationship. So that's one piece, but then also there are Indigenous ways of generating knowledge, other kinds of understandings of what counts as knowledge and things. So that is another whole piece, is like challenging the Western assumptions of what counts as valid, credible data, knowledge, and things. Like one example being something that people don't think about in research or as data is maybe dream activity. What's happening there, like for the researcher or the participants, and most people would be like, okay, that's not data, or I don't know how to use that or deal with that, that's not anything to do with this. But when you're bringing in kind of an Indigenous lens, that might be, or dreams may be, an important aspect of what's happening in your research process, and bringing that in and being able to have a space where people can talk about that or share that, those kind of things. So what that kind of pushes into a lot more is like spiritual kind of conversations, bringing in sacred aspects of reality that maybe in the West it's like, okay, no, science, like we have to push away like sacred concepts and things like prayer or things like that. Like that's not part of research, that's not part of knowledge. But Indigenous methodologies invites that in, having ceremony at the beginning of a research project, bringing in those elements, bringing in smudge and elders' guidance on what's happening with your data and things, getting different perspectives is a big part of this as well, is bringing in that kind of Indigenous lens to the work. Sorry, I feel like I've been talking a lot. That was a long. How's everyone doing? Any questions? Seems good, straightforward. Sorry, there's a lot of like, okay, here's this approach, and then this approach, and then this approach.
Don't apologize. Yeah, I think that's the first time, like I've done some qualitative research in undergrad, and it was very much like, okay, good luck, try to find what you're looking for and what kind of methods you want, and I've never had it so nicely laid out before.
A lot of it's information that can be palatable and understandable and reasonable, but usually, particularly medicine, when it's presented from a high, like in a way that isn't helpful. So having sat through multiples of these, and then my background is in a bit of sociology, something I find really frustrating sitting through because it's so important, and I feel like this is the first time I've had someone present it in a way that is attainable and makes it real and also gives it value. Whereas so in my opinion, and don't apologize, you have to speak because you're talking and explaining, but we can also ask, and
yes,
these guys will at one time.
Sounds good. All I see is like this row of computers and like, it's like, what's going on behind us? Okay.
It's pretty big.
I'll keep going then.
She's taking it. She's writing last time.
The examples that you're saying.
No, it's good.
And Andrew, can we have I'm not sure if I asked you before, but could you email me a copy of your slides so I can make them into a PDF?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no problem. No problem. Yeah, I mean, this is, and I'm here like as a resource. Like if people have questions about this going forward, like one of the things that was mentioned is you might have some projects or you have to engage in research or something over the summer. I don't know the details, but like if you are interested in this, like I'm around, like you can get my email and we can talk more about this if you have specific questions. So I'm also here to share this, but also as a resource in this university. Surprisingly, they hired someone like me here in community health sciences. I'm not the only one. There's maybe 4 or 5 of us out of 40 or 50 in our department, but there is a growing interest and concern for these topics. So we are around to help build capacity and literacy in these topics. So this really is just kind of a summary of what we talked about, the different forms of collection, the different kinds of theoretical perspectives. So I won't go into it in more detail, but it's more just like as a reference if you're like, oh, I was really interested in that one, but I don't remember what it was. Like this kind of charts can sometimes help pinpoint what you're interested in or the kinds of questions you're interested in asking. So let's spend, how much time? We have about an hour. Let's spend the rest of the time talking about interpretation, and I'll go through some very general basics, and then we'll do some hands-on things to kind of put this to the test, so to speak. So what do you do? So all those different perspectives are ways of generating data. They're ways of informing the questions that we ask, the frameworks that we ask, the way we interact with our community. All those different perspectives produce something. They often are produce stories, transcripts, and pages and pages and pages of stories. So it's like, okay, now what? You have all this data, what do you do? And that's the whole process of analysis. So with qualitative analysis, it's very different, obviously, because you're working with stories, you're working with words. Whereas quantitative, obviously, you're working with statistics, numbers, all of that whole world. So they're different, but there are some parallels, and I'll try to draw some of the parallels as well. So a lot of analysis is really looking and focusing on this idea of interpretation, of what is happening here. How do we interpret and understand what these people are saying, and what does it mean? What's the significance? How does this inform our practice, our policy, and so forth? What does this suggest for future research? That's the kinds of questions that you're asking. So it's really, so analysis and interpretation is really kind of the same thing. And how this happens, like, because interpretation involves viewing the data, so it's looking through a lens, through a theoretical lens. So that's why I outlined those different perspectives first. Like when I'm doing narrative analysis, I'm going to look at my data a certain way and kind of pick up certain key things. And as we'll see later, which I hope it works, is when you look at different words, the same story, through different lenses, you kind of pick up different things and different nuances come up. So that's why it's called interpretation, because even though you're all looking at the same data, the same story, you might generate different insights based on that, which again relates to your questions as well. So here's very generally the different pieces. So we talked about, okay, collecting data, going out, doing some kind of interview, focus group, maybe extracting something from Facebook with permission from whoever you have to get permission from to do that, but people do that. Looking at news stories, those kind of analysis. But now you have something, then you prepare it. So what you do then, so you have an audio recording of a focus group, you have to transcribe it. So that's the first thing, typing it out. And maybe you've had experience with that in some of your work, it can be a long time. Transcribing is a lot of work, it takes a long time. So a lot of people now, there's tons of companies where you send it out, boom, you send it, it usually goes to like India or somewhere, they type it up and then send it back to you. There's groups in Canada, there's even one at the U of M here, like a group where you send it to them, then you pay per hour kind of thing. But that's a big piece, is turning it into a file that you can then work from. Then you have this file, then you need to kind of read through it and get a general sense of what's happening, remind yourself, refresh yourself of what's happening. And then this is where you start to make codes, or you mentioned thematic analysis. Codes and themes are kind of the same word, where you generate like chunks of what's happening here in this statement. What does this mean? What are they saying? What's the theme here? What would I code this? If I had to have a word associated with it, what would I pin to it, so to speak? So So that's where we get this, and this process is often like cyclical. It's not just like you move through it and it's done. Like often when I'm in the middle of these projects, like you have papers everywhere, you're going back and forth between like interpretation and going back. Sometimes you even go back and listen because there's interesting cues that come up in the interview. Just the intonation and expression of somebody's voice sometimes is like, okay, what did they really mean there? You know, even things like sarcasm and like the way we talk, when you just read things, it's sometimes hard to really grasp it. So this is very much like a cyclical, iterative process, but that's what you're searching for. It's like the codes, the themes, the main ideas there. And so just some basic definitions. Code. Code is a word, short phrase that symbolically assigns one word to like a whole piece of data. So perhaps like ideas of self-confidence. You know, this youth is really talking, this whole paragraph they're describing, but what the essence of what they're talking about is actually about like self-confidence or identity. And so then I might code this chunk as identity. This is my identity piece or my self-confidence piece. So that could be a code. And then coding is basically developing those codes and applying it then to the stories, to the data as you go and read it. So sometimes people develop what's called a coding tree before you go and look at all your interviews. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's a little more of a quantitative way to do it, where you generate like an objective coding tree from consultation. Maybe some participants are part of that consultation. Then you give that coding tree maybe even to like objective people who weren't a part of the research, and you ask them to code the data. And you ask different people to code the same data. And then you're kind of comparing and looking across it. Okay, like how, in a sense, what you're looking for is objectivity. You're looking for, okay, are they all coding self-efficacy or identity the same? Are they coming up with different things? And you're kind of, some people go with that approach. Some people are a little bit more loose with that and look at, okay, everybody who codes, they accept that they're all going to have different codes. And that's just okay, and that's part of the process. So there's variations there. And another key phrase is around saturation. So often what you're doing, saturation is when there's no more codes emerging from the data. And this is kind of like a stopping point for some projects, maybe not phenomenology or things where I mentioned you might only have 2 or 3 interviews, but most projects, like our grounded theory work that we did with the HIV patients, that's something we were actually very interested in, was data saturation. So you would literally do interviews and code them, do an interview, code them, do an interview, until the interviews you start doing, there's no more new codes. Like all of a sudden the 15th interview, 16th interview, all the codes are the same. The stories are the similar themes. 17th interview, no new themes. 18th interview, no new themes. Okay, I think data saturation is now reached. We're not, like among this small context, this population, we're not generating any new codes. And so that's one potential signal that, okay, we're done our interviews, now let's just focus on analysis and interpretation.
How does that work in the context of, I understand the premise behind it, and I guess I used it myself, but broadly speaking, it also depends on who you're interviewing and who you're talking to. And
absolutely.
So if you're using like a snowballing technique, and those are how you're grabbing people, which sometimes, particularly for hard to research topics, makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. But then how are you ever actually able to say you've data saturated when really you're not actually able to ask everyone, which you never would be? You know what I mean? Like how in the qualitative lens do you explain that you're still being representative?
Yeah, I mean,
or you just don't, and that's an acknowledgement.
Yeah, the questions of generalizability and representativeness and things are very different. You're more interested in like authenticity, or like, are you capturing the voice of what's really happening here? That's more of the concern. But it is surprising how it can happen. Like I think it has to do with the scope of your research question. If you're asking something kind of broad, like what are the experience of resilience for Indigenous young people? It's kind of broad, and like I might not get at saturation. I could do 100 interviews here, I go to other cities, I do hundreds of interviews, and you're still kind of like trying to get at that question. But with our work in Saskatoon, just as an example, with the HIV, it's like, what are the experiences of HIV/AIDS for Indigenous people between the ages of 30 and 40 living in Saskatoon right now? And so when you have something kind of very narrow, you can start to see things
And
like...
what's coming from that is for that population.
Yes,
in particular. So
exactly.
you're not having one voice represent everyone.
That's right.
Specific catch rate is.
That's right, you're not trying to do that necessarily, but you're more trying to
Okay.
kind of just capture what's the experiences and what's happening here, yeah. So you try the best you can, but there's often things like pragmatic aspects that limit that ability. Just who, there's always questions of like, who volunteers to be interviewed? Like that's, you get a certain population of people who are the ones who always volunteer. But then there's a whole other group of people who are like one step outside of that ability to even feel comfortable volunteering to have research. So there's always that question of like, who are the silent voices that didn't actually get into our project? And so there's different techniques of how to kind of get in there. But yeah, those are important questions and things you're always kind of going through and thinking about as you go. But generally that's kind of the principle. You're looking for that. You're looking for enough of this story. And sometimes your question is about a specific person. Like, what are the experience of this person living with this chronic condition? So your N is 1, and that's it. And it's a case study, and you're looking at that person. Actually, some of the case study that we'll do is a project we did with 2 people. And that is it. So what is this? This, you can kind of see that a little bit?
Qualitative set.
So part of the work that we do, and so back in the day, what you used to do is kind of work with Word documents, and you'd see all these transcriptions, and you'd maybe highlight them, and you'd compile other Word documents for different themes, and you try to put them all together, and it gets a little crazy when you have a big project. Nowadays, most qualitative researchers use software. And they do their analysis through software because there's a lot of programs that can help with this. So this is one that I use regularly. It's called Deduce. There's 2 main ones. In Vivo is a big one. I don't know if you probably haven't heard of it. In Vivo is a big one, and Deduce is another big one. And basically what you do here is you upload your transcript, your interview. So in the main section, you see the story, the interview from the patient. And maybe don't read too hard. I don't remember what this is from, so I don't know if I have ethics clearance to show this, but anyway, we'll just pretend you can't read it. This is a transcript here of an interview, and what you see on the right, like this piece here, it actually says codes. And here you have all of the codes that have already been identified from different reads of the story. And basically all you do then is read through this and double click on these to which ones are happening. And they can be overlapping, there can be multiple ones of them. And that's basically what you do is go through each interview that you have. You can have 10, you can have 200. And you basically just go through and do the same process and code the stories. Then up here, it shows you which codes are being applied to which sections. So you can click on sections and kind of see, oh, interesting, I applied all these 3 codes to these same sections. And you can start to see overlapping relationships and things. So yeah, this is software very useful because this stuff can get complicated. So it's nice to, yeah, please.
So it's available through here at the university, you have to purchase it?
Deduce is for purchase only. In Vivo is on most of the computers here at the university. In Vivo is purchased by the university, and so it's available to students. I know in the community health sciences there's a computer lab and every computer has it. This one I purchased on my own, and the reason I like this one is because it's online. And in Vivo, you have to put something on your computer and work with it, or go to a computer and your data's on this computer. And for me, that drives me crazy. This is all online, so it's secure. To a certain extent. If somebody wanted to hack in there, I'm sure they could. But generally, it's a secured online system. And the nice thing about that too is when you're collaborating with people from different parts of the world or country, you can just all log in and access the same piece. And I can go see what somebody in New Zealand, how they coded that story versus how I did. And you can go in and kind of see that stuff. So it is for purchase. It's not expensive. It's $8 a month, something. It's not per person. So if you have 10 people in your account, it's $8 per person per month. but so it's not unreasonable. But one of the interesting things that you can start to do is these kind of analyses and matrix that are maybe hard to just do when you're reading a story and you hear like a theme. It's like, okay, well, how does this relate to other themes? So here you have like your different people, and here are the different themes across the top, so all of the main ideas. And then what you see in the middle are the intersecting points where certain people maybe commented on certain themes more than others. And this is hard to kind of see without these kind of analysis, these kind of frameworks. So I can click on that 37, like something's happening a lot there. Like there's a high frequency of social networks with participant 6. So why? What's happening there? What's going on? So I can go into the background of, okay, who's participant 6? What's different about their story? Why?
The numbers, like how many times you coded it?
That's right. Yeah. So all the numbers here are the frequency of how many times you've coded. So the interesting thing about this software too is now you can already probably start to think there's some quantitative pieces here that I can do. I can do some mixed methods type work at frequency counts for these themes. And sometimes journals, like when you're trying to get in like a higher impact journal, sometimes they want to see this stuff. You know, if you want to get your stuff seen and read, sometimes it's good to put 34% of the participants, blah, 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 said this and that.
Spoke about barriers, but not housing. What does that tell us about
exactly
preconceived conception of that?
Yeah, when you put in those details, sometimes it just helps create weight to what you're talking about. Or 89% of the people identified this theme as central. Like it helps to strengthen some of the arguments and interpretations you're working with. So I also like to dabble with some of that quantitative pieces as well. But it also brings one of the other things, I don't think I have a slide of it, but one of the other interesting things you can do is I can have all my codes here and all my codes this way, and actually looking at code by code analysis like that or something like this. So you can see, okay, how many times did coping methods come up with housing? And like, what's the frequency of those relationships in my data? And then you can start to see other interesting relationships, like, holy cow, every time housing's mentioned, addictions is mentioned. Like, why are those two so strongly related? And then you can start to see the story of what's happening with your population. It starts to tell you, give insight into the story of what's going on. So that's just a little snippet of, and there's lots of different kinds of analysis. These two are maybe the most powerful, but once you get everything in there and once you code it all, then you can do all kinds of interesting things to start to see what is the story, what's happening for these individuals, and it helps you be a little bit objective in the sense. I mean, I acknowledge that you can never be totally, but sometimes when you start to read these, you have kind of like, oh, I think this is happening, and you start to kind of like tell yourself that story. Whereas this kind of helps keep you like, this is what's happening. It's not kind of what you're thinking and leading you into that. It helps you kind of just stay a little bit protective and being accurate to what your data is showing. So before we do a little demo, I thought it'd be good to just go through this process a little bit. So we introduced the concept, code. So here's a section. This project, don't worry, we do have ethics clearance for this one. This is a project that was done for teaching purposes, so the participants are happy to use their stories in classroom settings and that. If anyone's concerned about that and you're going to report me somewhere or something, this one is good for that, so they're happy to. And I won't share what the experiences are of them, and we'll talk about that after, so maybe you can get some insights as we go. But let's read this and then see what you guys think. So I'll read it out loud just so we all hear it together. He cares about me. He has never told me, but he does. He's always been there for me, even when my parents were not. He's one of the few things that I hold as constant in my life, so it's nice. I really feel comfortable around him. Just a little snippet of a transcript. So what might you think? And so let's just kind of leave aside like all the different theoretical perspectives and ways I could view this for a moment, but like just generally what's happening here and what might you put as as a code.
Relationships.
Sorry, relationships, yeah,
Support our support system.
yeah. Anything else?
Stability, availability,
Yeah,
caring is something or things I would use to prove this.
yeah. So yeah, you're trying to like capture like what's happening here, what's going on for these individuals, and find words that represent or reflect that process. And the thing that we'll see is there often isn't necessarily right or wrong, like what words I choose might be different from someone else. That's why it's good to kind of consult and as a research team to agree. So these are some, when you're looking from the perspective of the individual, like this first sentence, he cares about me, he has never told me, but he does. So there's, aspects of like, what's my sense of self-worth happening here? Stability was mentioned. He's always been there for me, even when my parents were not. So just like that concern, comfortable, again, just that relationship piece. I really feel comfortable around him. So yeah, relationships is probably like a broader thing, and then these are under that in a sense. Is that clear? Is there any questions about this? Kind of just gives some idea into how this works. So again, that matrix that I showed of deduce would be like these things: sense of self-worth, stability, comfortable, and you'd be looking at all of those and how they interact. So you can start to imagine that what codes you pick is important and does really matter. So a lot of time goes into that, of how you do that and what happens with that process. So again, just some more definitions. Themes now. So now we did talk about themes and codes as being the same, but one way of looking at it also is themes might be broader, whereas codes are very kind of specific, small chunks. Oftentimes themes are a little bit broader. So the theme of the last one might be relationships, but the codes are like, what about relationships? Stability, comfortability, like these kind of things are maybe part of that broader theme. Codes grouped together, yeah. So that's often how the definition is themes are a little bit bigger, your codes are snippets underneath them, or describing aspects, defining your themes. When you look at, okay, what does relationships mean in this context, in this study, you would look at all the codes, and that's your definition. It doesn't come from a different theory, doesn't come from anything. It's like, that's, in this study, that's what relationships mean. Those are the codes. So you can develop kind of trees like this. Some of the software analysis that I showed you can do this, can start to link different concepts and the strength of them. Like it draws like bubbles, like this one is really strong, this one is, that kind of, you've seen mind mapping kind of activities.
I think they also help to connect a study that could involve whatever number of people to another study that could involve whatever number of people, but on a topic. So you can then say, well, we've seen these themes before.
Yes.
This is what they look like. Here's maybe how in this population or this group of people it was felt and experienced. But I feel like when you're talking about the bigger picture, that generalizability piece, it allows for that to be something where you take the simple, not so simple code and create it like something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and a lot of times this work can inform, like even though I'm working with Indigenous patients in Saskatoon, inner city context, like the knowledge there actually might be useful for Toronto and what they're doing, or Vancouver. Like there are some similar themes that might be relatable to inform practice in those other contexts. But yeah, how you go about that is a little bit different. All right, so now let's try to do this even in a little bit more in depth and get some examples. I've been talking a lot, so now it's an opportunity for you guys. How many of you are there? Oh, okay, I only printed 9. I didn't know exactly how many people would be, so maybe, yeah, generally like 3 groups of 3 and 1 of 4. And then the idea is to look at this data. So I have story, and it's the same participants as the last one. And there's basically just 4 excerpts or 4 kind of snippets of their story, and this comes from a longer transcript. And then some descriptions at the beginning, and what I think, we'll see if it works, but what I think would be interesting is to each group approach it from the different theoretical perspective. So try to go back into the mind of, okay, maybe this group will be the narrative analysis group, so what might I be specifically looking for in that context? And then the discourse analysis group, what kind of words, what's the phrases, and so forth. And then the phenomenology group, like what's the essence here? And then at the end we can kind of share and hear like different people's, hopefully you guys kind of talk quiet so you're not like sharing your answers or whatever with the other group, but then at the end we can debrief and hear across each of the groups and see and get some kind of an experience of what different frameworks do to data and how they give you different insights. Any questions about that? So we kind of loosely said you guys need a phenomenological group, discourse analysis, history.
Can you go back to that big slide of like the different types and what's different about it?
I did put at the top here like a summary of the bullet points. But yes, I can go back if you want me to switch back. But yeah, at the top there's kind of some general questions that this framework might ask, and like a basic definition of that perspective as well. So feel free to work together to share or individually, whatever is most comfortable, like read it through, get familiar with it. And then the part on the left, this is often how it's broken up too, is you see the transcript on the left, and then you have space on the right to actually input your codes and your themes. So then just feel free to start writing down some codes. What do you think is happening? Talk to the groups, kind of share the different perspectives and insights. Because sometimes it changes your perspective to hear someone else's. If you want me to flip back to a slide, let me know if that's useful.
We don't know the storyline behind this at all.
No, I'm kind of, I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
Just because that would argue